It started as an innocent connection, a bond one never expected to grow deeper than the family ties that held us together. But as the lines blurred and emotions grew more complicated, I found myself standing at the edge of a decision that would change everything. This is part 2 of my story, a continuation of a journey filled with choices, consequences, and secrets that refuse to stay hidden. In the beginning, it was never about crossing boundaries. He was my stepson, and I was his father's wife, a family dynamic that, while unconventional, seemed stable on the surface. But life has a way of weaving unexpected threads into our paths. We bonded over shared interests, late-night conversations, and moments of vulnerability that felt harmless at first. Looking back, I wonder if those moments were warning signs, but I ignored them, convincing myself it was just a close family relationship. The turning point came during a particularly challenging time in my marriage. My husband had grown distant, more preoccupied with work and less connected to me. I felt invisible in my own home, and the loneliness became unbearable. My stepson, on the other hand, seemed to notice everything, my sadness, my frustrations, even the smallest shifts in my mood. He was there, offering comfort in ways I desperately craved but never expected. What started as fleeting glances and stolen smiles soon turned into something much harder to ignore. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the pull. I told myself it was just a phase, a moment of weakness I could control. But the truth was, I had already crossed an emotional boundary, and the steps that followed felt inevitable. Each decision brought us closer to a point of no return. And then it happened, the moment that shattered the thin veneer of innocence we had been clinging to. I still replay that night in my mind, the choices we made, and the silence that followed. The weight of what we had done hung heavy in the air, and I knew there was no going back. The secret we shared would remain buried for now, but secrets have a way of surfacing, and the cracks in my life were already starting to show. How did it come to this? And what will happen when the truth finally comes to light? Stay tuned for the next part of this story. The days after that night were a blur. I tried to pretend everything was normal, going through the motions of my daily routine as if nothing had changed. But every glance, every accidental touch, carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. My stepson and I avoided being alone together, yet the silence between us spoke louder than words. The house felt different, tenser, as if the walls themselves knew the truth we were hiding. I spent sleepless nights lying awake, replaying every moment, questioning how it had gotten so far. Part of me wanted to tell myself it was just a mistake, a moment of confusion brought on by emotions I didn't fully understand. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just about loneliness anymore, it was about feelings I couldn't control, feelings I wasn't supposed to have. My husband, oblivious to the growing storm around him, continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He was busy with work, and when he was home, we barely spoke beyond the usual pleasantries. I wondered if he noticed my distracted behavior or the strained tension in the air, but if he did, he never mentioned it. The guilt weighed heavier every time I looked at him, and yet, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The hardest part was pretending everything was fine when I was around other people. Friends, neighbors, even family members who came by for visits, it felt like they could see right through me, even though I knew they couldn't. I was on edge, constantly second-guessing myself, wondering if I had slipped up in some way that would give away the secret I was so desperately trying to keep. And then there was him, my stepson. He seemed to be struggling just as much as I was, though he tried to hide it. There were moments when I caught him watching me, his expression unreadable, as if he was trying to figure out what came next. In those moments, I felt a mix of fear, shame, and something else I didn't want to name. We were trapped in a situation neither of us could fully undo, and the uncertainty of what might happen next hung over us like a shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that this secret, no matter how well we tried to bury it, was only the beginning of something much bigger. The question wasn't if it would come out, but when, and what would happen when it did. The weeks that followed felt like walking a tightrope, where every step could lead to disaster. I was constantly on edge, wondering when the delicate balance we were clinging to would collapse. My stepson and I rarely spoke unless it was absolutely necessary, but even then, our words felt heavy, layered with unspoken meaning. I wanted to talk about what had happened, to confront it somehow, but the fear of making things worse kept me silent. As much as I tried to avoid him, life had a way of throwing us together in ways I couldn't control. Whether it was casual family dinners or moments when my husband would ask us to handle something together, those encounters felt like a cruel test of my composure. I could feel his presence even when I wasn't looking at him, and every interaction was a reminder of the boundary we'd crossed. It was almost unbearable, but I couldn't show it. Not to my husband, not to anyone. My husband, meanwhile, seemed more oblivious than ever. His work consumed him, leaving little room for the family he was supposed to be holding together. At first, I was relieved by his lack of attention, but over time, it began to gnaw at me. How could he not see what was happening right under his nose? Or was it easier for him to ignore it, to focus on his job and pretend everything at home was fine? The resentment I felt toward him grew, even though I knew I had no right to blame him for the mess I had created. To make things more complicated, my stepson's behavior began to shift. He wasn't avoiding me as much as he had before. Instead, there were moments when he seemed almost defiant, testing the waters to see how far he could push. A lingering glance here, a subtle remark there, it was as if he was trying to remind me of the power this secret gave him. It terrified me, but it also made me question his motives. Was he trying to hurt me, or was he just as lost in this as I was? The walls of the house felt like they were closing in, the weight of what we were hiding pressing down on me from all sides. Every day felt like a gamble, as if the smallest misstep could unravel everything. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before something, or someone, pushed us past the breaking point. The tension in the house was becoming unbearable. Every interaction felt like a game of chess, each move calculated to avoid suspicion. But no matter how carefully I treaded, the weight of the secret was always there, lingering like a shadow that refused to go away. My stepson and I had mastered the art of pretending, at least on the surface, but beneath it all, emotions were spiraling out of control. One evening, while my husband was working late, the air between us grew thick with unspoken words. I had been avoiding the living room, keeping to my room or busying myself in the kitchen, but he found me there, standing by the sink. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me. The silence felt suffocating, and I could feel my hands trembling as I washed the same dish over and over. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm, asking the question I had dreaded, "What happens now?" I didn't have an answer. How could I? I told him we couldn't talk about it, that it was a mistake, but even as I said the words, they felt hollow. His eyes searched mine, and I could see the frustration, the confusion, and something else, something I didn't want to name. I turned away, hoping the conversation would end, but the intensity in the room was impossible to ignore. I knew we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, and I didn't know how to stop it. The situation only grew more precarious when my husband started noticing changes in the dynamic. At first, it was small things, a sudden quietness when he entered the room, awkward glances we couldn't quite disguise. But then he began asking questions, probing in ways that made my heart race. "Is everything okay?" he'd ask, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. I reassured him each time, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. He wasn't the type to pry, but his curiosity was growing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he pushed for answers. Then came the night that everything changed. My husband came home unexpectedly early, catching both of us off guard. I was in the living room, and my stepson had just come down the stairs. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a split second, I thought he might say something, anything, to unravel the fragile balance we'd been clinging to. My husband's gaze flicked between us, his expression unreadable, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. Something was about to happen, and I wasn't ready for it. The tension in the living room was suffocating. My husband's eyes darted between me and my stepson, his expression a mix of curiosity and something I couldn't quite place. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced a smile, trying to act natural, but I could feel the cracks in my composure threatening to show. My stepson shifted awkwardly, muttering something about heading upstairs, but my husband stopped him. "Wait," he said, his tone calm but firm. "What's going on?" For a moment, time seemed to freeze. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My husband's gaze was fixed on me now, waiting for an explanation, and I knew I had to say something before the silence gave us away. "Nothing's going on," I finally managed, keeping my voice steady. "Why would you ask that?" But the question only seemed to deepen his suspicion. Instead of answering, he turned his attention to my stepson. "You've been acting strange lately. Both of you have." His voice was still calm, but there was an edge to it now, a warning I couldn't ignore. "If there's something I need to know, now's the time to tell me." I felt my stomach drop. He was digging, looking for something, and I could tell he wouldn't let it go. My stepson, to his credit, kept his cool. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice steady. "Maybe you're just imagining things." But there was something in his tone, something too confident, too rehearsed, that made my husband narrow his eyes. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of my phone buzzing on the coffee table. Grateful for the distraction, I grabbed it and glanced at the screen, but the relief was short-lived. It was a message, an anonymous one. My heart skipped a beat as I read the words, "I know your secret." I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the message, my mind racing. Who could have sent it? How could they possibly know? Panic bubbled up inside me, but I couldn't let it show. I quickly locked the phone and set it back down, forcing myself to act normal. But my husband noticed. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Just spam," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. But I could feel his eyes on me, studying me, searching for cracks in my story. The air in the room was thick with tension, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Later that night, I found myself alone in the bedroom, staring at the message on my phone. I read it over and over, searching for clues, but there was nothing, no name, no number, no way to trace it. The only thing I knew for sure was that someone had been watching, and they knew more than they should. The fear of being exposed was bad enough, but the message raised new questions I couldn't ignore. Who else knew? And what did they want? It felt like the walls were closing in, the secret I had fought so hard to protect slipping further out of my control. I couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning of something far worse. That night, everything unraveled. The message weighed on me like a ticking bomb, but I couldn't figure out who was behind it or how much they knew. My stepson had been keeping his distance ever since the confrontation with my husband, but his behavior only added to the tension. I could feel the secret slipping further out of my control, and with each passing moment, the dread grew heavier. The breaking point came the next evening. My husband called us both into the living room, his expression unreadable but his tone leaving no room for argument. He closed the door behind us and stood there, arms crossed, looking between the two of us with a calm intensity that made my stomach twist. "We're going to clear the air," he said. "Right now." My stepson and I exchanged a panicked glance, but neither of us spoke. My husband took a deep breath, his voice measured but firm. "I'm not stupid," he said. "I've noticed the way you two have been acting, the awkwardness, the tension. Something's going on, and I deserve to know what it is." I opened my mouth to deny it, but before I could say a word, my stepson spoke. "It's not what you think," he said quickly, his voice shaking slightly. My heart stopped. He wasn't going to tell him, was he? But instead of confessing, he launched into a story, a lie so unexpected, even I was caught off guard. He claimed that he'd been struggling with something personal and that I had been trying to help him through it. "I didn't want to tell you because it's embarrassing," he said, his voice filled with just enough emotion to make it believable. "But she's been there for me, and I guess we just didn't realize how it might look." I stared at him, stunned. My husband's expression softened, though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. He turned to me for confirmation, and I nodded weakly, playing along because I had no other choice. "That's all it is," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry if it seemed like something else." For a moment, it seemed like the storm had passed. My husband sighed, shaking his head as if trying to process everything. But just as I started to feel a flicker of relief, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it instinctively, and my blood ran cold. Another anonymous message had appeared, and this one was even more chilling than the last. "Nice story. But I know the truth." I froze, my mind racing as I realized the nightmare was far from over. As I stared at the phone, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized there was no way to escape the truth anymore. Whoever was behind the messages wasn't going to let this go, and I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. My stepson caught my reaction and subtly shook his head, silently telling me not to say anything. But I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that this wasn't just about us anymore. The walls were closing in, and the only way out was to face it. Later that night, when my husband had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, trying to figure out what to do. The messages were clear, someone knew, and they wanted me to know that they had the upper hand. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to piece together who it could be and what they wanted. But the truth was, it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. Keeping this secret had only made things worse, and I wasn't sure I could keep living with the weight of it. My stepson appeared in the doorway, his expression a mix of guilt and fear. "What are we going to do?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't keep lying, not to my husband, not to ourselves. "This has to end," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't keep living like this." The next morning, I sat my husband down and told him the truth. Every word felt like a knife, cutting through the fragile life we had built, but there was no turning back. I expected anger, betrayal, even rage, but instead, he just sat there, staring at me in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but distant. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "I just didn't want to believe it." The fallout was as painful as I had imagined. My husband packed his things and left that same day, his silence saying more than any words ever could. My stepson moved out shortly after, and I was left alone in the house, surrounded by the echoes of everything I had lost. The messages stopped, but it didn't matter. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. Looking back, I realized there were so many chances to stop this from happening, so many moments where I could have made a different choice. But I didn't, and now I have to live with the consequences. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how carefully you try to hide them. The truth always finds its way out, and when it does, it leaves nothing th.